All right.
So welcome to the fall 2021 Cayuga Lake Watershed Network Community Conference. As you know, we do these conferences twice a year. They used to be focused one season at the north end, one season at the south end. But with the thrills and chills of Zoom technology, we're able to really provide watershed-wide issues. And tonight we've got two wonderful presenters. And just to make sure we're keeping you on your toes, they are in reverse order from what's shown to you here, October 27, 7 p.m. Rebecca Schneider will be our first speaker, and Nate Launer will be our second speaker. And I also want to point out to you that the second session of our Fall Community Conference is described in the right-hand column, November 18 in the afternoon. We'll have three people reporting to us about hydrilla around Cayuga Lake and across the Finger Lakes. And we hope some or all of you will want to join us. So now I'm gonna introduce Rebecca Schneider. I think many of you may have heard of her. Rebecca, to me, you're kind of a celebrity, a watershed health celebrity.
Thank you.
Because you talk about ditches as the plumbing of the watershed. And that was such a revelatory phrase for me to realize how important our ditching system is for water flow and runoff, and to realize how trivially we regard it. And in fact, after I heard that from you several years ago, I started a little saying of ditches are waterways too. And,
good.
You know, so we do spring cleanups, and well, we talk a lot about runoff, and so it was really great to bring that into the picture. And so now you're going to present about, I've sort of chosen topics for you, and I bet you're going to match up to it: ditches, drainage, runoff, and water quality impacts. And then you'll be followed by Nate, who will basically follow some of that runoff downslope and into the lake. So I'm gonna stop sharing, and you go right ahead. And
Okay, great. Let me just find my share screen button. Thank you. Screen one, share. And you all, let me know if you can. All right, can you see the whole picture?
Looks good.
Okay, great. So thank you, Hillary, very much for inviting me to be here today and to present this. The ditch part will be the core of the talk, but I'm actually going to present a bigger framework about watershed management. Hillary saw this as presentation to the Finger Lakes Watershed Alliance several weeks ago and said, would you present that to our Cayuga group? And I said, I'd be happy to. So I think some of you may have seen parts of this before. I hope there'll be enough new stuff to keep you excited. You don't have to, I'm going to present a lot. You don't need to take notes. I'm giving the PDF to Hillary and Jennifer so you can get access to it. Okay, so basically, first I want to put the context of being climate extremes that we're now experiencing, and then talk about watersheds as the framework for management. I'm going to talk about the key findings from our research on roadside ditches, and then what do we do to change management, and then some of the new things that we're working on right now. All right, let's start by putting this work in the context of global warming and climate extremes. And so we're seeing this intensification of our climate with an increase in the frequency and magnitude of high intensity rainfalls, which I think of as torrential downpours. In the past 100 years, it's increased by about 40% in the northeastern US. And in less than 30 years, it's increased by more than 75%. And even just last month, we had a 7-inch rainfall in 12 hours in New York City. So you know what we're talking about and these high intensity rains that we're experiencing. But we're also having more droughts here. And so we had an extreme event in 2016, which was almost comparable at the time to the drought that was happening in California. And so some places like where we are, we can go back and forth from floods to droughts. parts of California right now are having extreme rainfall this weekend. If you were watching football, they were dealing with rainfall. Okay, the floods are impacting everybody, individual homes, businesses, and community infrastructure. It all costs money. This is a photograph of the Endicott sewage treatment plant down on the Susquehanna River. The photo was taken in 2006 in the upper corner, and then 5 years later, we had flooding again, the same sewage treatment plant. That cost millions of dollars to fix each time. So the big overarching picture is we've got to get global emissions under control. Greenhouse gas emissions is absolutely critical. But in the meantime, that's a global, international thing that has to happen. But in the meantime, we need resilience and adaptation strategies that communities can adapt to deal with this and think more locally. How do we get to be more resilient? All right, I want to show you a different perspective because I teach sustainable water resource management. I work on some other problems that are about water globally. And this is a little bit of a different perspective. We view flooding as a disaster, but if you think about it, it's also an excess of fresh water. You can drink the water coming out of the sky. And globally, fresh water is growing in scarcity. It's usually evaluated on an annual basis, with countries which have less than 264,000 gallons of water per person per year as being considered water scarce. And that's on this map on the left. Anybody who's got like orange and red is already experiencing that. But a recent study showed that if you look at it on a monthly basis, 4 billion people for any given month of the year may have almost no water available. So that's more than half the world's population is dealing with some form of water scarcity. I argue, and a lot of people do now, that energy is not going to be the issue for the coming decade. It's going to be about water availability. And there's an example of a dialogue, international dialogue that happened in September. So I argue that, look, if we think of these intense storms also as an opportunity with an excess of fresh water, if we manage our watersheds better, then we have water that can be used to help provide fresh, drinkable water for people who need it. So for example, in August of 2014, more than 1 foot of rain fell in just a few hours, less than 12 hours in Islip, Long Island. In 1 square mile, that was enough water to supply the basic needs of 1,000 people globally for an entire year. That 1 day's worth of rain on 1 square mile on Long Island. And it's drinkable, you don't have to process it. So if we start thinking about how better we can manage our watersheds to capture the rain, we will have water that we can either share or give to other people or have in the future when we ourselves are having droughts. Okay, so where we start, this is where we have to get into think about how do we manage the watershed. And so I show these several slides to get everybody on the same page. What do we mean? All right. You need to understand the biophysical processes by which water moves through the landscape and that we end up with floods and droughts. It all happens within watersheds. The watershed is a bowl that captures the rainfall, and the lip of the bowl is the surrounding hills. The bowl determines how much rainfall you and your community have, right? It's relatively limited. It's a knowable amount of rainfall. And you have to remember, historically, we didn't used to be able to map like the landscape on larger spatial scale. So when they managed water, it was based on political boundaries. It had nothing to do with really how much water you had. It was pretty much unknowable. But now we do. We can say, here's how much water we have. It's within the bowl. And that bowl, the lip of the bowl, also determines the pathways of the water as it passes through the watershed. So basically, it's one of two pathways in the eastern U.S. When the rain first hits the surface of the soil, if it's relatively hard or compacted, it'll run off the surface or in the shallow surface layer fairly quickly and end up in the streams, our lakes, and finally to the ocean. And that's called the runoff piece, right? If the soil is really permeable, lots of holes and roots go through it, and there's lots of organic matter, the water infiltrates, it percolates down till it hits a hard surface like bedrock. Then it fills up all those holes. That's called groundwater. And that also moves laterally, downward, downhill, more slowly, but it ends up in our streams and our lakes and finally into the ocean. And it's a balance between those two pieces, all right? And the rest of the hydrologic cycle is evaporation and transpiration. That's evaporation from surfaces, and plant use of water is transpiration. And that is the key process that distills water, gets rid of all any contaminants. Pure H2O goes in the atmosphere, and that's why when it rains, we have clean water coming. It's a big distillation process. That's the whole cycle. And west of the Mississippi, that evaporation process and transpiration plays a key part. But where we are, it's really about this runoff and groundwater balance. Okay, so let's just start with the runoff piece. That's the part that moves where the water hits the surface and moves via the stream channel network, all right? Shown in this aerial image by Arthur Bertrand. You can see the mountains, the hills, which are the lip of the bowl, and you see the stream channel network where runoff occurs. And then there's a little map showing the stream channel network, and the lip of the bowl is the red line. Okay, we all know that streams and rivers naturally fluctuate in depth. And so this plot, the graph on the left, is called a hydrograph. It has time on the y-axis, the horizontal axis, and so that's 1 week of days, and has the depth of the water on the vertical axis. And what you see is the water depth is about half a foot deep. Then we have a rain event. The water level rises to 1.5 foot during the rain. Then it stops raining, and then the water depth gradually drops back down, and it keeps on flowing for many days, several days. And that's the groundwater piece that contributes to the stream flow and keeps it all wet and moving and flowing throughout the year, okay? On average, that groundwater piece is, on average across the US, counts for about 54% of the flow in our streams or rivers. So it's very important. And it's called base flow when you're looking at the stream. Okay, prior to European colonization of the United States, much of the Northeast was forested. We had these rich organic soils, a continuous canopy of landscape across the landscape. And so when it rained, water would hit the canopy, some of it would be held there, then it would more slowly, because it was intercepted when more slowly hit the soil surface. Then there was organic matter, which acts like a sponge, a cellulose sponge, and kind of holds on to some of the moisture. And then there were lots of holes underground, and the water would slowly go underground. So in terms of our balance, the red arrow is the runoff and the blue is the groundwater, and most of the water moved by groundwater, okay? We took that and we changed all that landscape. So as humans, as we've developed the landscape, we first cleared the vegetation for agriculture so we could grow things. So we got rid of a lot of the trees that intercepted the rain when it first hit the ground. We've actually gotten rid of most of the organic matter in the surface of the soils, both here. I studied work out in the Great Plains where there were very deep organic soils. And basically that eroded away, if you think of the Dust Bowl as wind, it eroded away by water, some of it burned off into the atmosphere. And so we don't have that nice organic sponge grabbing the water when it comes. And then we started to replace it with impervious surfaces. So we put in all these rooftops and roads and parking lots. And so what we did was take all that ability to absorb and allow groundwater to infiltrate into the ground and shifted that balance. So now that red arrow in the chart, in the graph there, is much bigger, right? In fact, it's most of our water runs off very quickly, and there's very little that goes down into the ground. All right, so in terms of the hydrograph, what you see pre-development, the blue, was that it would rain, the landscape would absorb a lot of it, most of the water would gradually rise in the stream, be level for a while, and then gradually drop back off. And then post-human development, we've shifted the balance, so now most of the water races right to the streams. It rises very quickly. So there's flooding. That's a flood event occurring. And then it drops rapidly. And then it actually drops all the way to zero. And that's because that's saying the stream has no water in it because we got rid of the groundwater. All right. It was never recharged. And so to me, this is kind of what I say is this is the good news, guys. We caused this. This is not the climate change piece, which is going to take huge efforts. This is what we're doing in our landscape, and we can change this. Okay, so that's the framework, okay? Now, how do we manage that landscape? How do we change it? All right. The overall approach we need to take is to start restoring the watershed and its landscape, enhancing its ability to reduce the runoff, to increase groundwater infiltration, and shift that balance back so that we can start to remove the part of the flood events that are happening that we're causing. Now, we'll talk some more about these big rain events. We need to do more to protect those parts of the landscape, the forests, and then we're going to talk about wetlands that capture rainfall, hold it, slow it down, and direct it underground. So this great thing happened in California in October of 2016. they said source watersheds are now recognized and defined as an integral component of California's water infrastructure. And because they did that, money that previously had gone to like dams, pumps, pipes, could now be directed towards protecting forests or wetlands. And so they are able to funnel a lot of money into infrastructure towards restoration of forests and watersheds in order to protect water. It's a great precedent, and we all need to, like, we can start thinking about that as an option for New York. Okay, a second piece that we can do in our landscapes around here is to focus more on our wetlands. Wetlands are playing, and we could give a whole seminar on wetlands, all right? I've studied wetlands for decades before I got into ditches, but they play a critical role in capturing and storing the rainfall and slowly letting it move through the landscapes, all right? Big sponges out there. There are many wetlands across New York State, and they're clearly identified on the federal wetland inventory maps, as shown here in blue. If you can see these little patches in blue, this is an example from Tompkins County, right? However, they are not necessarily the federal inventory is not a legal set of regulations about what gets protected. It's just here's where they are, okay? Unless they're a navigable water, most wetlands are not protected under the federal regulations. Certain ones are, and it's gone back and forth in the past couple decades. And some prairie potholes, for example, are not navigable, but they're now starting to get protection again. But they're not, small wetlands and all are not protected in New York State, or not always. And so we need to do a better job of protecting them. In this case, the ones that are protected in this map here by New York State are in green. And you can see there's a pretty big disparity between here's green over here, but all these blue ones over here aren't protected. So one thing we can do, we want to protect them so they don't get cleared and drained and filled and developed, all right? We want them to be out there grabbing this water so it doesn't start flooding the landscape, like just going straight to the streams across impermeable surfaces. So towns can create their own wetland ordinances. There are several in New York State that have done so. And we can also work with Albany to get stronger legislation. Legislators have tried to protect isolated wetlands in New York State several times. It hasn't worked, but we can work on that again. And then Tompkins County recently did its own wetland inventory, and now we can make that actually the legal set of wetlands that we want to protect. So that's another strategy we can do to try and make our landscapes better able to grab rain and hold it. So we also recognize the value of green infrastructure now. So we're making lots of headway, and green infrastructure helps capture stormwater runoff, like this little bioswale next to the road here that captures water coming off the road through those little gaps, and then it goes into what is like a rain garden. And EPA Phase 2 stormwater regs have been really valuable for promoting their adoption, but more needs to be done. And that's where the roadside ditches come in. All right, now, before I tell you about ditches, I want you to realize they're not a silver bullet, okay? They're not going to deal with these torrential large downpours that like 14 inches in one day that are now occurring. The soil cannot absorb that intensity of rainfall anywhere, okay? And there's going to be flooding. And so the truth is rivers are adapted to flooding, all right? If you don't put them in levees, like little berms, channelize them, they normally and naturally move around, they shift locations. And a good example of this is this map of the former Mississippi River's meanders on the left of the screen there. And that's all the different river channels as it moved around through time before we started developing the heck out of that landscape. And so the river naturally moves around during flood events, and trees, plants, fish are all adapted to this, all right? Trees in the floodplain can handle being flooded, right? And they don't die. The fish go up there, they lay their eggs during when it is flooded. And so we need to get back out of the floodplains, not leave people at risk. For example, in this photo on the right is a photo along the Shenango River. During a high flood event, you can see this young man looking over this levee with this wall. And if it broke, you can imagine the disaster that would happen. And it's like, guys, we're going to have more floods. We've got to get people out of the way of these river systems, and they will be healthier because of it. So let's get people and infrastructure out of the way, the entire community out of the way, and reduce their vulnerability, because we are, due to climate extremes, going to have these big events keep happening. Okay, our key fund, what have we done with our roadside ditch work? So I've been actually found the first presentation was in 2004 when we were just setting up our first studies, and here were our ideas, and now we've made a lot of headway. All right. Some of you may have seen this before, and so I'm just giving you like a short summary of the results. If you have questions I want to ask afterwards or email me, please do. So we've looked at roadside ditches are the parallel little depressions that are on both sides of every road, and they crisscross the landscape. And once we started looking at them, we said, well, what role are they playing in floods, droughts, and water pollution? We've done about, I think it's up to now 10 studies in 14 different watersheds in central New York and Pennsylvania, and we actually have one study in Java, Indonesia. The first thing you have to do is you always need to map the ditches themselves, okay? Where they go. Sometimes they go along one side of the road, then they go under a culvert and cross to the other side of the road, and then crisscross to another road, and then they end up in the stream at different places. So you need to map the ditches, know the directions of water flow and where they connect to streams, and then what's happening at the bottom of the ditches. Is it exposed dirt? Is it grass and vegetation? Is it rocks? So we map the ditch network first and overlay that on top of a stream channel network to see how everything connects. Then depending on what question we're asking, we always monitor how much water is flowing in the ditch, but we may look at suspended sediment, dissolved chemicals, how much bounces on the bottom, that's called bed load, or like fecal coliforms. And then in some cases, we model all this so we can extrapolate to a larger landscape. So what we have found out is that in any average size, about 20 square mile watershed, you'll have about 60 kilometers of ditches of stream and 51 kilometers of ditches. All right, almost equal to the length of the stream itself, and they dump in at 94 different places right to the streams. So what it's done is increase the effective length of the stream network, all right, from 1.55 on average to 2.73 kilometers for every square kilometer. So 2 to 3 times longer. So that means the land is more tightly connected to the water. All right, now the roads themselves only cover about 1% of the watershed surface area, but the ditches don't just capture what comes off the road. In fact, there are hill slopes that drain down to many ditches, and on average, about 22% of every watershed we've looked at of the surface area of the whole basin is draining to a roadside ditch. And that's why I'm showing you this photo of a hill draining to a ditch. And here's Lansingville Road over here. That whole hill slope up there, which is about 1.63 kilometers long, was draining down to this road. And then this one ditch captured all that water and shunted it right down here where they were having a lot of flooding. And so that's what happens. Ditches effectively, very quickly grab a ton of water and move it and discharge it somewhere else in the stream channel network. And it's fast. These ditches grab water, move it quickly, and so it shortens the travel time across the watershed. In this case, orange means it's slow, water moves slowly across the watershed, like 50 hours is bright red. And once you add the ditches, there's much less red. It's moving so quickly, things can move within minutes from the headwaters down to like the drinking water system of Cayuga Lake. This is actually Paynes Creek on the west side of Cayuga Lake. And this is a photo showing the sediment coming in from a ditch into a clean stream. All right, one of the main findings is all that water coming so quickly causes flooding in the streams, just like I explained before, all right? This is a hydrograph. It's the time during a storm, all right? The green is the depth of the water actually the amount of water flowing in the ditch, and you can see how high it is. The solid blue line is just the stream without any ditch, but when they come together, you're seeing a 300% increase in the amount of water now flowing in the stream. So there's all this water rapidly coming to the stream causes the flooding. That's what we've been talking about. Okay. All that water jumping into the stream actually scours it out during the storm. And so it's having an impact on the stream itself and causing erosion in the stream, all right? So here, if you're standing on this bridge, you look upstream, and this is a small first order headwater stream. It's only about 4 or 5 feet wide. It's only about 20 inches deep. As soon as you turn around and look downstream, after these 2 ditches have come on, this is now 12 feet wide and 5 to 6 feet deep. All that erosion happens due to the water carried just during the storms. And then the rest of the time, it's pretty much dried out. And we're now working with the U.S. Forest Service on the Finger Lakes National Forest to map the streams and see how much they've been impacted by the ditches. The ditches can be a source of sediment. We'll talk about everything else that comes in, but the point is, if you have an exposed substrate, when water runs through, it's going to carry dirt out. And so when they're scraped, when highway guys scrape the ditch and leave it exposed, then a lot of sediment can move down through the ditch into the stream. Additionally, it's a conduit for sediment, and as well as nutrients, phosphorus, de-icer salts off the road, things that are happening in the landscape next to the ditch get transported down the ditch. In this case, it's a lot of sediment from this field that's exposed. That line of trees at the end of the photo on the left is this intersection right here. And here's the sediment coming into the stream, and then it all gets carried down to Cayuga Lake. All right, in some places where there, and it's frequently up in the headwaters, you can have a lot of farm fields. We all love seeing all the green space. But if manure is spread, what can happen? That manure washes into the ditch or may go through by a tile drain, and then fecal coliforms. So these are living E. coli concentrations in this graph. The red line across the bottom is a standard from EPA. And what you're seeing is right with this first red arrow is when they spread manure one time in the field. And then we started monitoring E. coli in the ditch, and you see up to 25,000 counts per 100 mLs of water, ditch water. And that's live living E. coli. We didn't test for like pathogen microbes, but we did E. coli and fecal coliforms. And those E. coli were still present in the ditch for months after that single spreading. Viable E. coli. They gradually decreased down through the winter, and then the first spreading, the cycle started over again. We're wrapping up a long-term study we did on dissolved nitrate from manure spread farm fields. This is a watershed, a small basin. These two green patches are the basins that drain to the two ditches we studied. So here's two ditches. We monitored all the water flowing in the stream itself, and these are the concentrations of nitrate in the stream. And what you see, this is before these two ditches enter, and after each of these ditches enter, this is the increase in the concentration of nitrate in the stream, okay, due to just those two ditches where a ton of manure was being spread. And so it's a huge amount of nitrate moving through the stream and into Cayuga Lake. We studied whether there were filtering processes in the ditches that would remove the nitrogen. Microbes will turn nitrate into nitrogen gas into the atmosphere. That's called denitrification. And it does happen. It's not, and that's what this bar chart on the left is showing, is at each of our sites how much denitrification was occurring. And the green one is a reference site that had forests. The blue and the pale blue are both sites where were farm fields. And some denitrification occurs, but not enough to deal with the high concentrations of nitrate that were moving through the ditches. So the ditches contribute to flooding, they contribute to sediment, and they contribute to nutrient inputs. And we want to do something about that. So what do we do? So I was lucky because I found this photograph from about 100 years ago when we first started having cars and roads, and they all have this little dotted line or a line down the middle of the road. And over here on the left, what you're seeing, there's the ditch. And this is what we've been doing for 100 years. And highway guys have not been included in the conversation about water resources. They've been making sure we get to work every day and the roads are safe for us to travel. So how do we change something that's been going on for 100 years? Well, we've been working on building awareness, and we have talked, so through fact sheets. So one thing we create are fact sheets. The latest, we have several new ones about to come out, but the most recent one was don't dig a deeper ditch if there's downpours. And we distribute these. And we give presentations. So I work very closely with Dr. David Orr at the Cornell Local Roads Program, who is great, knows every highway guy almost in the entire state. We've now talked to probably close to 4,000 highway staff in New York State, Pennsylvania, and beyond, talking about, what's going on with ditches. How can we manage them better? So what do we tell them? What are we encouraging them to do? Two basic groups of strategies. The first, to reduce flooding. Now think about it. All you have to do is disconnect the ditch from the stream, and all that water doesn't go in there and cause the flooding. So if you take the ditch, divert it to a giant pond, an infiltration basin, some kind of detention pond, something that holds the water, lets it go back underground slowly, then you can stop the flooding. Now, meanwhile, the stream where that water would have gone, that stream still doesn't have its water. So ideally, we could put pipes under the road and just carry the water under the road and back down the hill. I mean, ideally, we want the stream to have water coming into it, and that would be the best solution. And in some places, that's possible. It is possible. Other places, though, if we can put something like these infiltration basins in, that would capture the water and help reduce the flooding. And then we have groups of strategies to reduce the pollution. And now they overlap, mind you. We probably need combinations of all these. But for one thing, we want to mow the ditches instead of scraping and leaving them exposed with exposed substrate. So mowing is way better. If there's vegetation in there, so just hydroseeding after they scrape the ditches can make a big difference. Hydroseed it, get the grass growing. Some places we could put in check dams to slow down the velocity so it's not so erosive. And there's other BMPs as well. And we can talk to you about what that suite of BMPs is. As I said right now, we're really trying to get out the message, don't dig a deeper ditch, okay? It's not gonna work. Not only is it unsafe, it causes slumping and erosion and sediment pollution. That's a post office vehicle I got a photo of, but actually it captures more water. And that's what most people don't get. It's not just now the surface runoff, but now they're starting to pick up more and more groundwater coming deeper in the soil profile. So more water is going through the ditch, which makes it even more erosive. What's really important is that we really need to get engagement with the people doing this in all the different towns, counties, and states. Because if the ditches in your neighbor upslope are not being maintained well, you're going to suffer the problems in your town. So you really need to be coordinating across these different boundaries. And so my graduate student, Sarah Davis, was evaluating how the Chesapeake Bay program was doing with their ditch management, and they have adopted roadside ditch management to meet the total maximum daily loads, which is directly relevant to our 10, I think it is, upper Susquehanna counties. And there is no coordination. So some states, all the ditch management and road management happens at the state level, like Delaware. New York State, most of our management of roads is happening at the town level. Others, it's at the county level, like Maryland. And so there's no hierarchical system. There's no top-down coordination of, look, guys, we all have to make sure we're not impacting each other. So cross-boundary coordination is really key. And you're going to be seeing a survey soon from Sarah to some of the towns about how much do you engage with your other towns around you and with your county to try and get us a sense of this. We did a survey in 2014, and let me see how I'm doing for time. I think I'm good. Of how the towns were doing with managing their ditches. And we got a pretty good response rate from the 1,000 different town highway superintendents, about 40% response rate. But so what we found out is basically 40% of them scrape the ditches and do not revegetate. And they do it once every 3 years. So, and they don't think it's important to revegetate. So that's basically the take home message is with 117,000 miles of town roads across New York State, 1/3 to 1/2 of them are in pretty fair to poor condition. That's the kind of take home message right now. We're not doing a good job. When we asked them what were the barriers, because I mean, we've been talking about this for so long, it's like, why is it not, why are we not communicating effectively? The barriers they reported, the first one's not surprising, limited resources, and they work super hard. And I know what my town's board is and how are the highway guys, they're out in the middle of the night plowing snow, filling potholes. It's a nonstop job. They have small budgets and the equipment is big and expensive and it breaks easily. So resources are definitely limited. But they also mentioned two other things: tile drains and right-of-ways. The tile drains are a key piece here, guys, and it's something we really need to start working collaboratively across the state to do a better job at. It's a kind of a loophole in the regulations about management for nutrients and pollution. They're increasing in their density across New York State. They put them in the fields and they drain the fields earlier in the spring so the farmer can get out there earlier and get planting. There's benefits to the farmer, but they also all dump them into the roadside ditch. And so they're highway guys say, hey, we didn't have a problem. And then we started having this flooding and, oh, there were tile drains being put in and nobody talked to us. And now we're dealing with the flooding. And so it's not everywhere. It doesn't cause, some soils are better at letting the water drain down into the soil instead of going out to the ditch. So It's not everywhere, but still, the tile drains, especially if manure is allowed to be put right on top of the soil, right above the tile drain, then the nutrients and the fecal coliforms can go almost straight to the tube, straight to the roadside ditch. And this photo just shows these large tubes, these rolls of tubes. This was all put in about 2 days. This photo in the lower right corner is from the Midwest in Iowa, where something like 50 to 60% of the Iowa landscape has been tile drained. That's what those all are. And now they're having problems recognizing it's contributing to nitrogen pollution in the Gulf of Mexico. So we don't have any good regulation. We have really kind of let this one slide in New York State, and we need to do a better job. Vermont has actually been paying attention to this, and I have some information from them if anybody's interested. The private landowners, their ditches and right-of-way. So this right-of-way is this really fascinating public-private interface. And since the highway guy said, we're worried about, we don't want to widen the ditch so we can mow it, because that belongs to the landowner and they might get upset with us. We're elected officials. And we said, well, what are you basing that on? So we did a pilot study with an undergrad in 2019. We put out 320 surveys and got about a 40% return rate. And this was to the private landowners who own the ditch and the right-of-way where the ditch is. And most people have no idea that it's a right-of-way, how wide it is, that they could be responsible for it. They don't know who is responsible for it. They don't like it to look messy. They almost all go in to clean up trash, some mow, and if it's not real deep, they'll garden in it. Most don't have any idea where the ditch water goes or think about it at all, but do care. So if I know it was polluting, I would change what I'm doing. Most have never met their highway staff, don't know who they are, but are glad they do maintain the ditches. And 50% of the respondents said they would accept an increase in taxes or widening the ditches to do a better job of preventing pollution. And so we are getting ready to run this whole survey across New York State to find out whether Tompkins County is rather unique because of all the universities in this ditch program, but we'll find out. Lastly, the new things we're doing are these wood chip bioreactor socks. So wood chip, big pits of wood chips are being used to take out that nitrate I was telling you about. It just denitrifies. We designed one that's about like a twin bed mattress size. And yes, if you put one in the ditch, it'll take out some nitrogen. You put two in a row, it'll take out some more. And that's what one of our new fact sheets is about. And this past during COVID year, just fascinating. I work with a student whose family's in Indonesia. The Bengawan Solo River is actually one of the second leading source of plastic trash to the Pacific Ocean, which if you keep track of this, that says a ton. And it turns out, sure enough, roadside ditches are transporting a lot of the trash, the plastic, into the rivers, which go to the ocean. And so we're saying, oh, wow, you can come right up next to the ditches. We can use that as a way to start capturing plastic trash. And so we're arguing that the roadside ditch networks can be used as the basis for a watershed-wide filtration system to address nutrients moving down into our lakes from plastics and trash, and we can tailor what structures we put in to help filter things out. Globally, ditches are a great opportunity. Roads are everywhere. I mean, where humans are, that's what the brown is on this page. It shows you the road density. And I have photos from all over the world showing the ditches next to roads in Ethiopia and China and Mexico. And it's like, oh, everywhere you go, there are ditches. And if we manage them better, it gives us a tool to deal with floods and droughts and water pollution. And the last thing let me just jump ahead for that. Thanks to you guys, this study came out in 2018. And up till then, all these watershed groups were getting funding to help improve water quality, but there was no evidence. I mean, the measures of success were people's satisfaction. But this study in 2018 evaluated 2,000 watershed groups, looked at water quality in those watersheds, and showed that where there was a watershed group working, there was an improvement in water quality. And so what you all do makes a difference. And if you want the paper, I'll get it for you. But it's basically, the more money you have, the better the water quality. But nonetheless, what you do makes a difference. There, I think I'm exactly 40 minutes. Thank you, 45 minutes, I think. And I will stop screen sharing. Any questions?
Thank you very much, Jen. That was wonderful, and I could probably watch it a third time and learn a whole bunch more stuff.
Okay, so I probably went a little fast then, but I'm happy to share the PDF, and I'll answer questions and send me emails if people want to, and whatever, in the Zoom recording too. You can all look at the Zoom recording.
Yep, and we're going to make this available on our fabulous Cayuga Lake Watershed Network YouTube channel. So we'll let everybody know about that. Jen, do you want to kind of handle the questions? It looks like there might be one in the chat.
Sure. I invited anyone who wanted to throw a question into the chat to do so. Please feel free. And the first question, Rebecca, was curious about any activity regarding legislation to improve ditch management, and if not, when would there be enough data and information to start? Okay, so
New York State's definitely, all right, so something like Vermont actually has a regulation for Lake Champlain for ditch management. New York State has done a good job of starting to buy into this. So the 12 lakes that were included in the HAB money to try and, as demonstration lakes basically, have strong programs or strong guidelines and recommendations to focus on ditches. There's not regulations that I'm aware of at the state or town levels, no. But there's a lot of encouragement, guidance, and people are paying attention.
Great, thank you. Another question came in that reads, have you followed up with any of the landowners you surveyed to share practices that they can ditches and if they had applied them?
All right, so we asked the question, would you like more information? And about a third said yes, and about a third said maybe. This was an undergrad honors thesis. She just graduated. We actually just finished writing up her paper. And the way we work when we have students is we really let the students get their work done, get it published, and then start doing things with it. So we are ready to make a fact sheet based on the first set of results, even though it's just Tompkins County, and we will be distributing that information. So we're almost there. Again, you have to work with a student. That takes priority. I usually give myself like 1 to 2 years per student, but soon.
Great, thanks. Something else that popped in, Charlie reads again, Seneca County recently instituted a plan for septic system inspections.
Great.
He understands from the DEC report, septic systems are a small part of the phosphorus load to Cayuga Lake. Should Seneca County put more, should Seneca County put more emphasis on ag runoff and ditch management?
Okay, I really applaud them for taking on the septic system, potential problem piece of this. And across New York State, I think it's like 19 million people have septic systems. We do. And honestly, we bought our house. I came from Baltimore City. I didn't even know what a septic system was. So until things started backing up, nobody tells you. Nobody says, oh, you have to empty that periodically or it's going to, become a problem. So there's no education program. There's no inspection program. So we have a lot that can be done better with septic systems across New York State, especially in shallow soils, close to the groundwater table, near lakes. I know Skinny Alice Lake did a really good job trying to manage septic systems around that lake because it was the drinking water source for Syracuse, and they put in electric toilets in a lot of the, so I strongly encourage any county to start creating or encouraging some kind of inspection system and just even telling the realtors to tell people when they get a septic system and a little bit about how to manage it. So now Seneca County, we've definitely given ditch talks there. I'm not sure who's running I'm supposed to be meeting sometime soon with somebody over there about their ditches and their program. And I work with like Jerry Varigny and some of the soil and water conservation people on a couple projects. So there's a general awareness, but I don't know how county-wide it is. And I'm not sure which groups. I've definitely talked to soil and water a little bit, 1 or 2 towns, but I don't know how much it's been adopted as a holistic, overarching kind of program.
Thanks, Rebecca. Another question that came in is, do you have data related to the municipalities around Cayuga Lake to gauge the volume of interest and willingness to discuss ditch management?
Okay, so that's what Sarah Davis's survey is going to be. Basically, that she's putting out for her doctoral research. She's very interested in transboundary issues of water management. She's actually been worked internationally and seen how this issue of water movement across boundaries is so key. And we're focusing it. She's going to do an analysis of how much the towns interact with each other about that. So towns and county level. And so that's will be our first kind of documentation of how much the towns are really thinking about it and cross working collaboratively. That'll be, let me see, she's doing a pilot run right now with County Ulysses on the survey and Mark Watts down in Chemung. When she gets that back, I think the survey will probably go out in about a month. And that'll be to all 1,000 towns across New York State.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, what's the effect of brush hog cutting at road edges? Well,
it's better than scraping the ditches. So when I see them, and I don't have a great picture of it yet because they're usually moving, but when they brush hog, I mean, you're leaving vegetation and roots. The point is you want roots and plants in the bottom of the ditch so that when water hits it, it's not eroding away dirt, and it slows the velocity down and forms these little eddies. So the erosive velocity of the water is less, and then it slows it down so it doesn't rush right to the stream. So any kind of mowing practice at all is better than scraping it and leaving it exposed. The brush hogging, I mean, so ideally, if they're brush hogging, it's sometimes because it's so deep, right? They just kind of run this thing over the top, as opposed to if you have a much shallower, it doesn't have to be more than 1.5 feet deep. So I've talked to David or at the local roads program, he's the engineer there. Almost every road ditch does not need to be more than 18 inches deep. That's it. It'll take care of the undersurface of the road and so it doesn't freeze. And if it's that shallow and it's wide enough to mow, then people will engage more with their ditch and garden and mow it themselves. So it helps with, the workload. But I'll still take bush hogging, which is just cut everything down, over leaving it exposed.
Thank you. There was a comment that came in from Marion. Thank you, Marion. She says, not a question, just a point of information. Cayuga County sanitary code that requires that all septic systems be inspected periodically and at the time of a property transfer. We just had to pay to have our home septic system inspected. And
cool.
3 to 5 years.
Excellent. Excellent. I'll be embarrassed if I found out my town required this because we just had to figure it out on our own. And it's like, okay, now we do it. But that's great to hear. I really, and then education to people, because also you don't want to put toxic substances in there that kill the bacteria that do all the breakdown. There's a whole education campaign that's needed for that. That's great to hear.
All right. Well, here's a question. Are there specific good native plants, parentheses flood resistant, that could be planted in ditches, or is grass best because it's easy to seed / mow / maintain?
Okay, so it depends. It's like a rain garden. If you ever look into rain gardens, it depends a ton on the slope, how steep it is, and therefore how wet it is and how often it gets dry, right? Because it goes from wet to dry. These are ephemeral systems. In the summer, they can get bone dry and burning hot, right? So then you're not going to put wetland plants in there, so it's kind of like you have to pick the right group of plants that can handle that kind of highly variable set of conditions. In lower, flatter terrains, so coastal plain ditches and all, they can be wet a lot. And so you'll see cattails growing in some of our ditches, which have almost become like a ephemeral stream that keeps kind of going. So you kind of have to work with your ditch and how often it's wet, how often it's dry. And then assuming you can go, you're going to maintain it. Yeah, you can put all kind of garden plants along the edges and then wetter plants at the bottom. Grasses are great because they work so well off their root systems. Once those root systems get established, they're pretty tolerant, and many can handle the flooding, which is periodic. The only thing you have to be very careful about when they hydroseed, where they come in and put in this nice mix of grass seed, fertilizer, and a little paper pulp, if they're not watered for the next 2 to 3 weeks until they get those roots established, it will die. And a study of bioswales in Washington State of 100 different case studies. They all died because they weren't maintained. So you imagine you put that seed in there, it just gets a tiny little root out, and then it dries up and it dies. So it's the after maintenance, after hydroseeding, to get that grass up and running that is key. But grass is pretty good. You can do a lot with a good thick lawn of grass in there for stopping erosion, slowing down water velocity, and stopping sediment transport. And then you get some filtration, like, the organic matter in the soil builds up, you can get some pollutant removal.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. And I have one final comment, unless anyone wants to put anything else into the chat, from David. He says there are so many miles of ditches, right? So for work crew supervisors that have the job of keeping these things clear, wouldn't increase time and cost to be frequently maintaining vegetation to some specific level?
Okay. So in a nutshell, yes. But what we're realizing is this public-private interface, which on average is about 10 feet wide, across New York State is the equivalent of about a 500 square mile park, right? Think about what we do to manage parks for water quality, all these things, right? This is interdigitating our entire landscape, and we can improve, reduce flooding, water pollution, all these things, and get all these benefits. And so it's like, wow, people are willing, they care about it a ton. They do not want it sloppy and messy. Thinking of it as making an attractive part of our landscape, people love nature and it's good for them. And if you think of the ditches, well, we're already getting that right away. We're already getting all these benefits, electric wires, telephone poles, and the ditches. And it's like, oh, just a little bit of extra effort. And it would take working with highway guys and people educating them. They aren't just our janitors, our road janitors. They are our water stewards. We have to stop thinking of them as this kind of group that just kind of deals with the trash, keep our road clear. No, you're the ones who are our plumbers, our water stewards. We value what you do. We love that interface and want it to be attractive. It's a bioswale. They can be really beautiful. They become places people want to be. So I think it's a matter of changing our entire mindset about what this interface is, how it's treated, who manages it. And that single survey we just did, if it's true across New York State, it says people want that. They're willing to pay money. They're willing to give up their land in front of their house. All right, to do better. So I think that's very encouraging.
So Jen, do we have time for any more? We want to give Nate a clear shot starting at about 8.
Yeah, let's do this one quick thing. If you think this would be a quick answer. The last question that came in, would the mapping help identify higher priority areas where they could target the limited time and staff resources that are available where additional maintenance and vegetation is most needed?
Yep, and we're working on, it's in our to-do, we're trying to come up with a simple model to say, how do you figure out where those are? The highway guys tend to know. You talk to them, they know where the ditches are that they spend most of their time in. So, but working together to say, but we can also help you with this other area that's causing part of the problem. So yes, developing a set of a decision-making tool is on our to-do list.
Great, Hillary. I think we're ready.
Okay.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much. I have an entertaining set of ditches in front of my and my neighbors' houses. I go for the cattail model, as do 2 neighbors to the east. And then the neighbor directly next to me to the west gets out herbicide and carefully sprays and kills every bit of grass or other vegetation in their steep-sided ditch.
Yeah, okay.
It erodes and piles up in my cattails. So,
okay, there it is. Yep.
Different styles right there next to each other.
Yep.
Okay, so now we have Nathaniel Launer of the wonderful Community Science Institute and Certified Water Lab in Ithaca. And Nate is been working with Steve Pennington and CSI staff for several years now as coordinator of the amazing lake.
Oh, Hillary, you went on mute.
Hang on a minute. Sorry about that. So Nate Launer with the community, I'm going to watch that mute button, with the Community Science Institute is going to report to us on what I hope is the finale of the harmful algal bloom season on Cayuga Lake, because I know that it went on a little bit longer than anticipated this year. So take it away, Nate.
It did, yeah. Thank you, Hillary. I'm going to share my screen here. Let's see, and we've got a beautiful title slide here. A photo brought to us by HABs Harrier Holly Davidson. And this is a bloom that happened in her lakeshore zone on Cayuga Lake this summer. So let's see, there it is. All right, so yeah, thank you. As Hillary said, I am the Director of Outreach at the Community Science Institute. We are a nonprofit organization that many of you may know right here in Ithaca, and we work with volunteers across the Finger Lakes region to monitor water quality, analyze water quality samples at our certified lab in Ithaca, and really work to raise awareness for local water quality issues in the community. So today I'll be talking about our 2021 harmful algal bloom season. And as Hillary said, it was quite a tough season for harmful algal blooms on Cayuga Lake. And it did go longer than anticipated, which we'll get into later in the slides here. I see a lot of our HABs Harrier volunteers out there in the audience this evening. And so first of all, I want to extend a big thank you to all of you who helped make this program possible during the summer. We really couldn't do it without you. And it's helping provide some incredible data about harmful algal blooms on Cayuga Lake here. So thank you. So before we dive into those data sets and what happened on the lake this year, I just want to do a quick review about what harmful algal blooms are. I know that many of you might be well acquainted with harmful algal blooms, so I'll go quickly on this. But although they're commonly referred to as algae, these are actually blooms of what are called cyanobacteria. Now, cyanobacteria are an ancient single-celled organism, and it's thought that their evolution dates back billions of years ago. It's actually thought that they're one of the first known oxygen-producing organisms, one of the first photosynthetic organisms on Earth. And it's thought that they contributed to our oxygen-rich atmosphere that many later life forms were able to evolve in. And so that's a really important thing to remember, is you can kind of think of these cyanobacteria as the ancient ancestors of modern day plants. And like modern day plants, they really like sunlight. They like to grow in with water, and they really thrive when you give them nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen. Now, cyanobacteria are part of the aquatic community in lakes and ponds and oceans around the world. They're a natural part of the community. They're not invasive. However, these cyanobacteria do produce some chemical compounds just through natural processes that aren't fully understood. But we do know that some of these compounds are toxic to humans and other animals. And this is part of the reason of why we call these blooms harmful. Now, there are many different types of cyanobacteria or taxa of cyanobacteria. And the two most abundant type of taxa of cyanobacteria that we see on Cayuga Lake that form these harmful algal blooms are Microcystis type cyanobacteria. And you can see a nice micrograph of a Microcystis colony on the upper picture there. That was taken of a bloom on Cayuga Lake. And then the other most abundant taxa that we see here on Cayuga Lake is Dolichospermum. And you can see a nice picture of Dolichospermum under the microscope from a Cayuga Lake bloom there. And you'll see from those micrographs that these types of cyanobacteria are quite distinct in appearance once you get them under the microscope. But unfortunately, to the naked eye, they appear the same on the surface of the water. So there's no way to just look at a bloom and tell what type of cyanobacteria formed it. Now, when we talk about these blooms of cyanobacteria or harmful algal blooms, What we're referring to is kind of the rapid growth of cyanobacteria populations or the accumulation of cyanobacteria to a concentrated local area. So this is different than the modest population growth that occurs as a natural seasonal cycle. So in freshwater bodies around the world, we can kind of characterize this change in the population of the phytoplankton community with this simplified chart here on the right. You can see the abundance of different types of phytoplankton in freshwater bodies on the vertical axis there, and the months of the year on the horizontal axis. And it's really simplified, but essentially what it's showing is that, you know, the population of diatoms, a type of phytoplankton, tends to peak in the early summer months, followed by a peak in the population of green algae. And then right around the warmest months of the year, in July, August, and September, we tend to see a natural peak in the population of cyanobacteria in freshwater bodies. And that's because cyanobacteria love to grow in warmer water temperatures. It's really where they kind of excel. That's their niche. And so, but again, this kind of modest peak in population growth is different than a harmful algal bloom. Harmful algal blooms are kind of this runaway rapid population growth or accumulation of cyanobacteria cells that form these kind of dense surface scums on the surface of the water or even at lower depths. Now, while the causes of bloom formation are still under study, there is general scientific consensus that cyanobacteria populations tend to grow better in warmer water temperatures, as we discussed, that high nutrient concentrations, such as of phosphorus and nitrogen, have been shown to help facilitate and promote the growth of cyanobacteria, that cyanobacteria do really well in still and calm and stratified waters, such as Cayuga Lake, which stratifies during the summer months with a nice warm layer of water on top and a deep cold layer below. And that's because these cyanobacteria can actually regulate their buoyancy and they can flow up and down in the water column. So when they want to kind of exploit those nice warm water temperatures at the surface of the lake, they can do that and really help kind of facilitate their own growth. Now, on the flip side, prevailing winds may lead to the formation of harmful algal blooms just through kind of the wind-driven accumulation of cyanobacteria cells to a specific shoreline. So many of you who live on the lake and who are HABs harriers might have seen this kind of phenomenon before, where you can see, you know, kind of colonies of cyanobacteria speckled throughout the water column, but they haven't formed a dense surface scum. You can imagine a large area of the surface of the lake looking like that. And what would happen if the wind kind of pushed all of those scattered colonies to one specific shoreline, and how that would accumulate on that shoreline, just as, you know, fallen leaves in the water column would. Now, these factors aren't universal though, and they can vary from lake to lake and even within a lake. You know, we always talk about nutrients as being one of the primary factors that promote harmful algal blooms. But, you know, there have been low nutrient lakes such as Skinny Atlas Lake who are also dealing with the issue of cyanobacteria blooms. So here on Cayuga Lake, like many other lakes in New York, there have been an increasing number of harmful algal bloom reports in recent years. And in 2017, there were so many reports here on Cayuga Lake that a lot of concern grew in the community about what this meant for the future of Cayuga Lake and its health. And so in response, we formed the Cayuga Lake Harmful Algal Bloom Monitoring Program in collaboration with the Cayuga Lake Watershed Network and Discover Cayuga Lake. And the purpose of the program from its inception and what it still is now is to provide, you know, these timely hazard warnings to everyone who use Cayuga Lake so that they can make safe decisions about when and when not to swim in the lake water. And also to develop detailed information about the occurrence of these blooms that we can use to inform risk management strategies and maybe even track the response to our watershed management practices and how they might hopefully reduce bloom occurrences in the future. Now, the program is a partnership of these three organizations and a network of dedicated volunteers around the lake, who we call our HABs Harrier volunteers. So these volunteers get trained in how to identify a bloom and how to collect a sample for analysis. And then during the summer months, they monitor a section of shoreline once per week, or at least once per week. And if no bloom is observed, they submit what's called a no bloom report, essentially signaling that the shoreline is clear. If a bloom is observed, however, volunteers report the bloom right away so we can get it up on our reporting page to alert the public. And then they collect a sample and transport it to our certified testing lab in Ithaca for analysis. Now, the program has grown really nicely over the past 3 years here, from monitoring roughly 31% of Cayuga's 105-mile shoreline to now just about 57% of the shoreline in 2021. Now, this summer, we had another successful HABs monitoring season. We started off the season, as many other volunteer groups did, with another round of Zoom volunteer trainings. But luckily, they went smoothly, and everyone was able to attend. So we were able to, together, with over 90 HABs Harrier volunteers, monitor roughly 57% of the shoreline. We documented, and here's the, quote unquote official number this year, 102 harmful algal blooms on the shoreline of Cayuga Lake between June 29th and October 14th. So our highest number of blooms yet. It's really something to hit this 100 bloom mark, and certainly not something I anticipated seeing, when I first joined into this program in 2018. We also stocked brochure holders around the lake with harmful algal bloom information and reporting guides that help inform the public about what cyanobacteria are, how to watch out for harmful algal blooms, and what to do if they encounter one. And so we've been able to work with state parks and put those brochure holders up at all of the state parks around the lake, and all of the natural areas as well, such as Salt Point Natural Area. So that's been wonderful. Below there is a picture of a brochure holder right here in Ithaca at East Shore Park, which is a favorite spot for a lot of lake goers. So that's a wonderful part of the outreach that we've been able to do. We also tested all of our bloom samples this year for Microcystin toxin. And this is, an accomplishment that we're really proud of. As many of you may know, that New York State DEC was supporting the funding of analyzing bloom samples from lakes across the state. But in 2019, they discontinued that funding. And so we are now one of the only, if not the only, harmful algal bloom monitoring program in the state, still testing all of our bloom samples for Microcystin toxin. And so it's a wonderful strength of our program, and it is in large part due to our dedicated funders and supporters, and also our hardworking laboratory staff who analyze the blooms day in and day out during the summer months. Another exciting thing is that we will also be testing a subset of these blooms this year, again, for another type of toxin called Anatoxin, which is something that is a known toxin that can be produced by the Dolichospermum type cyanobacteria that we see on Cayuga Lake. And so we're just trying to get a better sense of whether it might be present in the blooms that occur here. And in the bottom left there, you can see a great aerial photo. That's a drone photo of a large open water bloom that occurred on August 26th. That was taken by Bill Hecht, who many of you may know, and that occurred at the northern end of the lake there. So this year was quite an eventful HABs monitoring season with blooms occurring throughout the summer months. But really this year was kind of characterized by two major bloom events. And it really kind of distinguishes it from the 3 years prior that we've been monitoring the lake. So the first of these bloom events occurred on July 19th and 20th. And during these 2 days, we had reports of 13 really widespread harmful algal blooms in the southern end of the lake and in the main lake. These blooms were, all reported to be over a mile in extent. Below on the right there is a drone photo of a widespread bloom that our volunteers were reporting extended, from Myers Park all the way south to East Shore Park. So a really massive extent there. On the left is a panoramic photo. That's a photo of a widespread bloom that occurred on Lansing Station Road. And that bloom also was reported to be over a mile in extent. And so this was kind of a massive bloom event that occurred on these 2 days. Interestingly, the bloom event did follow those heavy rains that we all experienced in July. And then they occurred on a few days right after the rain took place, when we had calm wind conditions on the lake and the sun came out and it got nice and warm. And so it supports the idea that, that rainstorm preceding this large bloom event could have constituted a large kind of loading event in which lots of nutrients and sediment were transported to the lake, potentially supporting the growth of this kind of large biomass of cyanobacteria. Now, our second kind of bloom event of the year, our widespread or almost lake-wide bloom event here, occurred on October 6th. So it was really late in the season for Cayuga Lake. And unfortunately, this one was even worse than the July 19th and 20th bloom event. So on October 6th, we had 21 blooms that were reported at locations around the lake. And at all of these locations, volunteers and public alike were reporting that these blooms were widespread, kind of as far as the eye can see. And so we did our best to kind of narrow down and sift through the bloom reports. And we were able to determine, 18 kind of distinct locations where these blooms were present. But again, very widespread, all extending, as far as the eye could see in any of these locations. All of these blooms on that day had very high levels of microcystin toxin, ranging from just over 6 micrograms per liter to as high as 1,951 micrograms per liter. So hundreds and hundreds of times above the limit for microcystin in water used for recreation. Now, interestingly, large kind of lake-wide blooms were also observed on Seneca Lake and Canandaigua Lake on this very same day as well. And so that kind of indicates that, maybe it was something to do with the weather that day that helped facilitate the formation of these widespread blooms. A really kind of unique thing that we heard from each of the volunteers who sampled all of these locations around the lake was that they reported absolutely no wind on the lake that day. They said it was just kind of dead calm, and that lack of wind might have helped facilitate the formation of these blooms. So when we take a look at when the blooms occurred during 2021, these two kind of widespread bloom events really characterize the pattern of when blooms occurred, as we talked about. So below is a graph showing the daily count of harmful algal blooms that occurred during the 2021 monitoring season, and with the number of blooms that occurred each day shown on the vertical axis there, and the date on the horizontal axis. Now, the blooms are color-coded by their microcystin toxin concentration. So gray are those blooms that we were unable to test for microcystin toxin. And that does happen from time to time, whether it's because we were unable to grab a sample or the sample was collected in a container that wasn't appropriate for microcystin testing. Occasionally that does happen. Green are blooms that had a microcystin level less than the method detection limit for microcystin, which is 0.3 micrograms per liter. And importantly, 0.3 is also the health department limit for microcystin in finished drinking water. Black are blooms that had a microcystin level greater than 0.3, but less than the recreation limit of 4. And red are those blooms that had a microcystin concentration that exceeded the level for microcystin in water used for recreation of 4 micrograms per liter. And in some cases ranged as high as 2,500 micrograms per liter. So many, many hundreds of times above that limit for recreation. Now, this year was not only marked by these kind of large lake-wide bloom events, but also the many number of blooms that occurred in October, which was pretty unusual for us here on Cayuga Lake. We had 26 HABs that we documented in October, and that's compared to 1 last year in October, 2 in October in 2019, and 0 October blooms in 2018. Again, these widespread bloom events, these blooms occurred on 37 days during the summer months, yet we documented 24 more blooms this year than last year. So the blooms in October, kind of these large widespread bloom events, both might account for this large increase in the number of blooms that we recorded this year. Now, this summer bloom occurrences had a similar spatial pattern to that of the bloom occurrences in 2020, in that, high toxin blooms occurred in both the northern and the southern halves of the lake, which is different than in 2019 per se, when high toxin blooms only were found to occur in the northern part of the lake. So while nearly kind of the same number of blooms occurred in the southern half as in the northern half, which you can see there, 43 blooms in the southern half compared to 59 blooms in the northern half. Over twice the number of high toxin blooms occurred in the northern half of the lake compared to the southern half. So 42 high toxin blooms in the northern half of the lake and just 18 high toxin blooms in the southern half. And we'll get into a little bit more about why that might be in a few slides here. A really important distinction is the type of cyanobacteria that forms the bloom. And we'll talk about that in a second here. Now, having this kind of multi-year HABs data set is really important because it allows us to make these interesting comparisons about when and where these blooms occurred year after year. So comparing this year to the 3 years prior. Shown below are 4 of those daily count graphs that you saw on the previous slide, with the daily count graph for 2018 on the top and the daily count graph for 2021 on the bottom. And what you can see here, really kind of roughly, is that the pattern of when blooms occurred on Cayuga Lake this year was much more similar to that of 2018 and 2019 in a sense, where we had these kind of distinct peaks in bloom occurrences in kind of mid-July, and then in around September or later in the season, but kind of a lull of bloom activity in between. This is different than last year in 2020, when blooms kind of occurred pretty much evenly and continuously throughout the summer months without any really peaks or lulls in bloom occurrence. This year, we also saw kind of what seems to be characteristic of Cayuga Lake blooms, which is the frequent occurrence of low toxin Dolichospermum type blooms in early July, both in 2018, 2019, and again in 2021 here. We tend to have these many kind of Dolichospermum formed blooms in Cayuga Lake that kind of kick off the bloom season. They seem to be the first type of cyanobacteria to really get going and grow quick and form these blooms. And what's interesting about those blooms, again, you can see from the color coding here, is that those Dolichospermum type blooms early in the season tend to have very low or, much of the time non-detect levels of microcystin toxin. So when we compare the annual count of blooms each year, we can also see some interesting patterns. This is, a graph that's colored in a similar way. So again, it's categorizing the blooms based on the microcystin toxin that we measured in them. But this is instead the annual count of blooms over the past 4 years. And you can see that the number of blooms that we've documented has increased each year from 40 cyanobacteria blooms in 2018, 67 in 2019, 78 in 2020, and now 102 in 2021. And along, parallel to that increase, we've also had an increase in monitoring coverage, which could account for some of that increase in the number of blooms documented. So from 31% of the lake monitored to now roughly 57% in 2021. But interestingly, another pattern that we see in this is that in the past 2 years, in 2020 and 2021, we have seen a greater number of high toxin, high microcystin blooms that have occurred on Cayuga Lake. So, from 28 high toxin blooms, or 42% of the blooms in 2019, to 55 or 71% of the blooms in 2020, and then 60 high toxin blooms, or 59% of the total blooms in 2021. So this is a really interesting thing to track each year as well. And it can kind of help give us an idea of the general composition of blooms that occurred each year, and whether they're kind of trending towards more high toxin blooms each year or not. Now, a really interesting pattern that our kind of multi-year HABs data sets are revealing, and one of the, really highlights the strength of being able to test all of these bloom samples, is that the microcystin toxin level in these cyanobacteria blooms on Cayuga Lake seems to increase with the bloom biomass when microcystis type cyanobacteria are present or dominate the bloom. And so shown here is a graph. All of those dots are blooms that we were able to analyze in 2018, 2019, 2020, and 2021 for levels of chlorophyll A, which is our measure of bloom density, and levels of microcystin toxin. Now, the level of chlorophyll A is graphed on the horizontal axis there, and the level of microcystin toxin is graphed on the vertical axis there. And I'll note that the axes are in logarithmic scale. So even though you can see here some of those safe guidance values look pretty close to the most high toxin blooms, in reality, those blooms are many hundreds of times above the limit there. Now, all of these blooms are color-coded not by their microcystin concentration in this graph, but instead by the type of cyanobacteria that we observed in the bloom. So blue are those where Dolichospermum was kind of exclusively the only type of cyanobacteria that formed the bloom. Gray are those blooms where Microcystis cyanobacteria was present, maybe Dolichospermum type cyanobacteria was present as well, but there was kind of generally a mixed assemblage of taxa that formed the bloom. And orange are those blooms that were dominated kind of exclusively by Microcystis type cyanobacteria. And so what we're seeing here is that as blooms grow in their density, the more dense blooms are, the higher the microcystin concentration tends to be only when Microcystis seems to be present in the blooms. You can see for these Dolichospermum type blooms, these blue dots on the bottom of the graph here, even these really highly dense cyanobacteria blooms of Dolichospermum often don't exceed some of the regulatory limits for microcystin in water used for recreation. And so you can see kind of that big difference there between, these two blooms. And again, I've included the micrographs of the different types of cyanobacteria to show how different they do appear under the microscope. These two blooms that are roughly similar in density, so at the same spot on the horizontal axis here, but have very, very different levels of microcystin toxin. Now, while the October 6th bloom event was really concerning because of its kind of lake-wide extent, it was also a really important data collecting opportunity, and we're really excited to continue to sift through the data that we were able to collect that day. And it's really exciting because it was almost this kind of lake-wide synoptic HAB sampling event. And that's thanks, in all aspects to our HABs Harrier volunteers who actually, October 6th was passed when they were supposed to, when the season was officially supposed to end. But these volunteers continued to monitor the shoreline and were willing to get out there that day and respond to this big bloom event and collect samples. So it was really amazing work by them. So you can see here a map of that October 6th lake-wide bloom event. And I've included the time that each bloom was sampled and the microcystin toxin concentration. And what's really interesting is that all of these blooms were sampled and occurred, in a roughly 4.5 hour span of time. So it creates this really interesting sampling opportunity where we've collected all of these samples of blooms from around the lake, at the same time, kind of during the same conditions. And so it really allows us to compare, one bloom from the next under really similar conditions. And one of just kind of the tentative, trends that we see in this October 6th bloom event was a little bit of validation for that association that we highlighted between the density of the bloom and the microcystin toxin on the previous graph. Just like the previous graph, here is the density of the bloom measured by total chlorophyll on the horizontal axis and the microcystin toxin on the vertical axis. And just as in the similar graph, we have colored the blooms by the dominant type of cyanobacteria that formed the bloom. And you can see here that the association between the density of the bloom and the microcystin toxin that was detected in it was really strong that day. And so it provides some validation to that multi-year finding that we presented in the slide prior. So a really interesting data collection opportunity, and we're really excited to dive into that a little bit deeper. Now, whenever I present this data, people always want to know, so does this mean that HABs are getting worse here on Cayuga Lake? And it's a really difficult question to answer. I like to say that we have a data set that's, excellent because it's now 4 years long, but it's still only a 4-year data set. And it's going to take time to understand, whether the blooms are truly increasing and at what rate. What we can say is that monitoring HABs on Cayuga Lake has systematically improved over the last 4 years. And this awareness and understanding of blooms has a lot of benefits in itself of helping to manage the risk that these blooms present and helping to kind of deal with and live with these blooms for the time being. Again, this table just highlights the number of blooms that have been documented each year. And since the development of our program in 2018, we have had increasing shoreline coverage. And so again, part of the increase that we see in the number of blooms could be attributed to that increase in shoreline coverage and that greater awareness of what harmful algal blooms are and what to do, how to report one when you do observe one. So, you know, it sure looks like harmful algal blooms are increasing on Cayuga Lake. But, you know, what we can say for now is that harmful algal blooms may have increased in recent years. And we're also getting a whole lot better at identifying these blooms and reporting them. One thing that we, you know, are starting to see is that it seems like the number of blooms with high concentration of Microcystin toxin might be increasing, at least in the years that we've been monitoring and testing blooms. And also something that's interesting to note is that the number of blooms in October this year suggests that we could expect the HAB season to be a little bit longer in years to come. Again, it's kind of just one, you know, long season this year, but it could be something to expect in years to come here. And so what can kind of help us understand and frame this issue of harmful algal blooms and their emergence in water bodies, you know, across the state, but also globally, is it can really help to turn to the larger scientific community and research that is being done to understand this emerging issue. You know, harmful algal blooms do have ties to climate change. I've pulled out a couple different interesting research snippets here. In the 2018 Fourth National Climate Assessment, in their chapter on the effects of climate change on water, they state that, quote, the risk of harmful algal blooms could increase due to an expanded seasonal window of warm water temperatures and the potential for episodic increases in nutrient loading. Other research would seem to agree. The next quote is from a 2021 study on lake stratification. Again, that's the process where lakes separate into a warm layer on top and a cold layer on the bottom during the summer. And these researchers found that, quote, under high greenhouse gas emission scenarios, stratification will begin approximately 22 days earlier and end approximately 11 days later by the end of the century for freshwater bodies in North America is what they were referencing. And that this could facilitate phytoplankton growth and an increase in the occurrence of and intensity of toxic algal blooms. So there does seem to be this general scientific consensus that climate change could cause an increased frequency of HABs due to warmer surface water temperatures, an extended period of lake stratification, and episodic and intense rainstorm events that will help transport nutrients and sediment into water bodies. And, you know, halting climate change, as we've talked about already tonight, is a long and complex process, but we can limit nutrients into our streams and lakes starting right now. And there is general scientific consensus and strong consensus that levels of nutrients in water bodies, as well as high nutrient inputs, help facilitate the formation of harmful algal blooms. And because of that, the DEC, among others, cites that, quote, nutrient reduction strategies are the most effective tool to reduce anthropogenic eutrophication, and that reducing HABs will require controlling both nitrogen and phosphorus inputs. And so I just wanted to highlight those research articles just to say and kind of start to bring up some ideas about what we can do to address harmful algal blooms on Cayuga Lake. Because when we're faced with an environmental problem like this, it's always good to start thinking about solutions right away. And so the first thing that we can do is we can continue to monitor and report these blooms on Cayuga Lake. This is kind of the best way to help avoid any exposure to these toxic HABs. You know, Cayuga Lake is still a beautiful, high quality lake to swim and enjoy during the summer months. And as we all know, we can easily avoid these blooms when they occur by understanding how to recognize them and knowing what to look out for. And so in that sense, educating lakegoers and outreach about harmful algal blooms is really essential to helping us deal with this issue right now. And reporting is also really important because it's helping to build these data sets that help us better understand the occurrence of blooms, why they're occurring, and the risk that these blooms present. And so that's really important because it helps us inform kind of risk management strategies around the lake. You know, whether that's putting out public announcements to watch out for blooms during specific times during the summer months when data has shown that we can expect a peak in the number of blooms, or asking people to, you know, take caution at certain parts of the lake during certain times of the year. And so those are really important opportunities for these data. The second thing that you can do is participate in any efforts to help reduce nutrients and sediment that flow into Cayuga Lake. And wonderful examples of this are kind of the replumbing efforts and the best management practices that Dr. Rebecca Schneider discussed in her presentation. Those are wonderful opportunities to help address this issue. You know, you can also help learn about and promote and develop watershed, you know, kind of plans to help achieve targeted nutrient reductions in the tributaries that flow into Cayuga Lake, such as watershed rules and regulations, or 9-element plans, for instance. And finally, you know, we can all do our part to strive and be a water quality conscious resident. And one of the ways that we can do this is through things like the Lake Friendly Living Program, which the Cayuga Lake Watershed Network here on Cayuga Lake helps coordinate for residents around Cayuga Lake. And it's a really wonderful program and provides practical ways that you can work with your own land to help reduce nutrients and runoff, and to help protect the water quality of the region. So before I end here, I just want to give another big thank you to our HABs Harrier volunteers, especially our really hardworking HABs Harrier quadrant leaders. I can't thank you enough. They really help the program run during these summer months. You know, whether that's Christy Van Arnhem, you know, always transporting samples down from Aurora to get them to the lab, or Glenn flying a drone up to get a picture of a bloom at the southern end, or Bill Ebert helping to, you know, transport samples down from the northwest quadrant. Really, I can't thank you enough. It's really helpful, and it's really wonderful to see everyone come together to make this program possible. So thank you. And I will stop sharing here.
Great.
Thanks, Nate.
Thanks, Nate. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So in the interest of time, we did have a couple of questions come into the chat. I invited anyone to use the raise hand feature if you wanted to turn on your camera. Anyone can turn on your camera at this point in time if you want to feel like you're part of the group. Please feel free to do that. Rebecca, I saw your hand was up. Did you want to throw the first question out, or you just giving a shout out? Okay, perfect. Okay, great. So let's pop into the questions. Let me see. I'm gonna scroll up a little bit. We'll start in the middle. For Michelle, do HABs blooms correlate with seasonal macrophyte die-off?
That is a good question. I would have to see some data on seasonal macrophyte die-off to answer that. I don't know if you have any insights about that, Michelle, you could share.
That just means you got to stay tuned to the next presentation of this conference and have a conversation.
That's true.
There we go.
Thanks. And talk to Bob Johnson.
Yes, yes, indeed.
Great, thanks. There was a question early on, Nate, a while ago in your presentation. What magnification are the microscope photos taken at? And is it easy to see the differences between the two taxa with a typical compound microscope?
Oh gosh, I would have to check the exact magnification. I believe it's either, it might be right around 100, but I'd have to check to be sure. It typically takes kind of a higher powered microscope to see the difference in the taxa. But, there are, some pretty affordable microscopes that you can get where you can see the difference. I'll check on that. I can send out an email.
Great, we'll let y'all know. Perfect. Another early question, Nate, that came in was, has anyone correlated bloom events or toxin level with rainfall data? A plot of average toxin level for a time period, a day or week, versus rainfall for the same time period may be enlightening and potentially assist in developing solutions.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. I haven't seen anything like that where people correlate rainfall amounts with either bloom occurrences or the toxin level of the blooms. I think it'd be really interesting to see for the number of bloom occurrences correlated with rainfall events. The toxin level, as we talked about, it's kind of a quality of the bloom that is very dependent or seemingly very dependent here on Cayuga Lake on the type of cyanobacteria that forms the bloom. And so it may be less associated with rainfall or environmental factors like that as it is with, the type of cyanobacteria. Yeah, that's a great question.
Another early question from Marion. She asks, of the 103 blooms, 103, what were the proportions of microcystin and dolichosperma?
Nate actually answered that question in later slides, so we can move on from that one.
Sorry, Marion. Okay, great. Thanks so much. And thanks, Nate. Sorry, I'm just scrolling through. Okay, let me see. Another question, is there a significant correlation of cloud cover on the October 6 bloom, which followed the October 5 storm?
Interesting. Yeah, that was one of the kind of notable weather observations that day, is that the lake, it was very cloudy that day, which is really kind of different from when we typically observe blooms. Typically it's on really sunny, really hot days where you have a lot of direct sunlight shining down on the lake. But on that October 6th day, it was really cloudy skies. So an interesting observation.
Great, thanks.
Add to that for 2 seconds, Jen.
I'm sorry, sure, go ahead, Michelle.
The reason I asked the question was because that's actually a study that's being done or had been being done at the DEC hub.
Nice, that's wonderful. Yeah, the effects of direct sunlight or cloud cover.
Awesome. Great, thank you. Rebecca is curious if we use social media to transmit info on a bloom to lake users. How do we use social media? Was that your question, Rebecca? Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, and luckily we work with the Cayuga Lake Watershed Network to do a lot of our outreach around harmful algal blooms. So maybe I'll actually pass that question right over to Hillary or Jen.
Sure. Make sure I'm not muted. We've been working with CSI on this now for 4 years. We get ourselves via a wonderful arrangement with Lauren Chambliss at Cornell, an intern, HABs communications intern each summer. And this past summer, for example, it was the wonderful Alora Cisneros. And she put out 10 weekly harmful algal blooms updates about Cayuga Lake, working with the data that Nate was sharing on a weekly basis, and reached, I don't think we figured out exactly how many thousands of people via an extensive media list and thousands of email addresses. And those were very lively and informative. And then I got interviewed a few times on WHCU and other radio outlets about it. I sort of gave, HABs updates, and I think, Nate, you were interviewed as well. So, and part of, in addition to Nate's wonderful HABs Harriers, we've got a habshotline@gmail.com email address, so that members of the public who have learned how to do this send photos, location, date, time, etc. And Nate, I know that you say that the Harriers have got a pretty high accuracy rate on recognizing harmful algal blooms at this point, and
Yeah.
it seems that the public's gotten pretty good at it too.
They have, yeah. Yeah, and just another small, thing to add to that is that, these blooms that happen on Cayuga Lake, they all seem to happen really quick. There'll be times even where someone from the public will report a bloom, and we'll email them back, asking, if a Harrier can come and collect a sample. And sometimes within an hour, sometimes within half an hour that it takes for them to email back, their next email will be, oh, well, the bloom is gone now. So it's a tough one to kind of synchronize the public outreach with when the blooms are actually occurring.
Great, a couple more have come in here. Question about, has any attempt been made to normalize the number of blooms by plotting number of blooms versus % of shoreline monitored?
A great question, yeah. To be released, yes, we are working on it because we do recognize that the monitoring coverage is a factor in the number of blooms that we observe each year. And so, yes, to be released soon. But we are working on it.
Ever changing. Okay, so here's an interesting question. Is there any way to speed the testing process when HAB samples have been taken? For example, at Aurora, the health department closed our swimming beach during each HABs incidents and shut down our drinking water plant until testing results were in, which would generally be 2 to 3 days after the HABs incidents. The net effect is that the swimming beach was offline most of the summer, and our drinking water processing became somewhat erratic as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a couple different parts to this. The first is kind of the framework that's used by the Department of Health and New York State Parks to regulate public swimming areas. And that is when a bloom occurs, to shut down the swimming area and wait not only after the bloom is gone, but 24 hours after the bloom has gone. And then at that time, 24 hours after the bloom has gone, they collect a sample of water to be tested for microcystin. Now, if that sample of water, of just lake water, non-bloom conditions, is below the limit of 4 micrograms per liter, then they'll reopen the public area for swimming. However, I think what the question is also getting at is that once they send that sample away, it can often take, a day, 2 days, maybe even 3 days to get that microcystin result back, which results in kind of these long periods of beach closures. Even, many days after, now at least 24 hours after the bloom has dissipated. Now, part of that is because there's not many labs in New York State that are certified to test for microcystin toxin. I believe CSI is one of, 4, I think, commercial labs in the entire state. So commercial meaning accepting samples from the public who is certified to test for microcystin toxin. There are other kind of state labs and government labs like the Wadsworth lab for the Department of Health, but depending on where those samples go, say if they're being transported quite some distance to be tested, that may result in kind of the delay in testing time. The microcystin test itself, EPA 546, is a really difficult and complex lab analysis. For us here at CSI, it takes, roughly 7 hours of a single analyst's time to get a result on a bloom sample. And so, yeah, for all those reasons, it does take some time. It can be sped up essentially by using the nearest lab, and, hoping that they're able to get those results back as fast as they can.
Thanks, Nate. We just have one other question in the chat. And then after this, if anyone would like to use the raise hand feature or unmute yourself and ask, please feel free. But the last question, and please unmute yourself if I missed your question in the chat as I went through. But what's in here is, what other organisms other than people and pets are impacted by HABs?
Yeah, there's not a whole lot of research on this, and we've looked for it quite a bit. Not a whole lot of research on whether it impacts fish. There have been, some studies in other countries of analyzing the amounts of cyanobacteria that accumulate in the gills of trout, for instance, or the effects of cyanobacteria on birds. But really, it's not a well understood area of study thus far. So we'll keep our eye on the research, but not too much yet.
Thanks, Nate. Any final questions for Nate or for Rebecca? Actually, we've got just a couple minutes left. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask at this point in time. Pretty informal here. I'm not seeing any. Are you seeing any hands up, Hillary? I'm not seeing any hands up.
No. All right. Great. Michelle is clapping. I think that's a clapping.
I think that's a clap. Is that a clap? Yes.
All right. Well, then we're coming up to the end of our time together this evening. Thanks, Rebecca Schneider and Nate Launer, so much for your masterful and astonishing presentations. I want to remind everybody that part 2 of our fabulous fall community conference will be on November 18th, 2:30 to 4 p.m. with 3 presentations about hydrilla around Cayuga Lake and regionally. One other thing, I'm very excited that our website, www.cayugalake.org, has got a wonderful new resource on climate change. Have a look. This is pioneered by our chair, David Wolf, working with our fabulous web guy, Mike Duttweiler, to start to provide specific information about how climate change is affecting our watershed locally. And I think that's pretty exciting, because we hear a lot about global climate change and decisions that need to be made, but this brings it right home. And of course, there's also information on what we can be doing about it to mitigate our impacts on climate change, and also to maybe make things a little bit better as we have challenges and problems, like all the people who had very wet basements last night, for example. Okay, I'm getting a little rambly here. I want to thank everybody very much for coming tonight, and thanks, Jen, for making everything work so smoothly. Yes. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Hillary.